Cleopatra was born in Alexandria in 69 BC, into a dynasty that had worn the crown of Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and yet never entirely ceased to feel like a house from elsewhere. Her family were the Ptolemies, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's Macedonian generals, and by the time of her birth, they still ruled from the glittering capital on the Mediterranean, rather than from the older sacred centers farther up the Nile. In public, they were pharaohs, heirs to the ceremonies and symbols of Egyptian kingship. In blood, language, and court culture, they remained largely Greek. That dual inheritance shaped the world Cleopatra entered from her first breath, a kingdom ancient beyond measure, governed by a dynasty that was at once established and insecure, rich and brittle, splendid and threatened. Alexandria itself gave that contradiction a visible form. Founded by Alexander and made the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, it faced the Mediterranean with confidence and drew to itself merchants, officials, scholars, priests, sailors, migrants, and courtiers from across the known world. It was a city of harbors, palaces, processions, and ideas, famous for learning and for the mingling of peoples as much as for power. Yet even in its brilliance there was a certain distance from the older Egypt of temple towns, priesthoods, and the deep agricultural life of the Nile Valley. Alexandria belonged to Egypt, but it also belonged to a wider Hellenistic world. Cleopatra was born into that meeting place, where Greek speech and Egyptian devotion, royal theater and hard administration, intellectual ambition and dynastic fear all lived side by side. The kingdom her family ruled had once been the wealthiest of the Hellenistic states, and in many ways it remained astonishingly rich. The ordered fertility of the Nile, carefully taxed and managed, sustained a government of unusual reach and efficiency. Grain, trade, temple wealth, and bureaucracy gave the crown resources that other rulers might envy. But by Cleopatra's birth, that old strength no longer meant freedom of action. The later Ptolemies presided over a state whose revenues were formidable, though its political independence had narrowed. Rome had risen in the Mediterranean until even a wealthy kingdom like Egypt was compelled to calculate every important decision in relation to Roman interests. The Ptolemies still wore crowns, but Rome increasingly decided how secure those crowns would be. Her father, Ptolemy XII, stood at the center of this uneasy world. Ancient writers and later historians remembered him as Euryaltes, the flute player, a name that carried mockery as much as description. He did not inherit an unquestioned position. Britannica notes that his claim was shadowed by doubts about legitimacy, and that this uncertainty helped drive his heavy dependence on Roman support. He ruled not with the calm authority of a secure monarch, but with the habits of a man who knew that enemies could question his right to reign and that foreign power might be needed to keep him on the throne. During his reign, Egypt became in effect very close to a client kingdom of the Roman Republic. That condition, half sovereign and half dependent, formed the political weather of Cleopatra's childhood. Cleopatra's own place within the royal household was shaped by a family pattern that had long ago become customary among the Ptolemies. Brothers and sisters married each other. Rival claimants were not merely distant cousins or ambitious noblemen, but often immediate kin. A daughter might be a ceremonial ornament one year and a rival sovereign the next. A brother might be both husband and political threat. This was not a household in which affection and survival could easily be separated. Cleopatra was most likely the daughter of Ptolemy XII and his wife and sister Cleopatra V Tryphena, though some uncertainty about her mother remains in the historical record. Even this uncertainty is telling. The court into which she was born was one where names repeated across generations, women vanished from the record, and legitimacy was as much a political weapon as a fact of birth. So the child who would one day become famous did not begin life in a settled golden age. She was born into the final century of Ptolemaic rule, when the dynasty still possessed ritual grandeur, but had lost much of its former confidence. The kingdom had already surrendered territory and strategic freedom. Rome had annexed lands once connected to Ptolemaic power, and Roman politicians looked upon Egypt's wealth with growing interest. For Roman statesmen burdened by debts, ambitions, and civil competition, Egypt was never merely a distant ally. It was a prize, a granary, a treasury, and a lever in larger struggles. Even when Rome refrained from direct annexation, its protection came with pressure, and its friendship carried a price. Cleopatra was born into a monarchy that could no longer ignore the moods of the Republic across the sea. This pressure bore directly on her father's reign. Ptolemy XII maintained himself through diplomacy, payments, and bribery on a scale that weakened the very kingdom he was trying to preserve. He sought recognition and security from Roman power brokers, among them Pompey and Julius Caesar during their rise, not because Egypt lacked wealth, but because wealth alone could no longer guarantee political survival. The court in Alexandria must have understood, even if only in whispers and fragments, that royal authority now depended on conversations held in Rome, on promises made to men who did not speak for Egypt and did not need to love it. In such a climate, the young Cleopatra would have seen early that kingship was not simply inherited. It had to be negotiated, defended, financed, and displayed. For all that, the monarchy still wrapped itself in ceremony. Ptolemaic rulers presented themselves in Greek and Egyptian forms at once. In one setting, they were Hellenistic sovereigns, speaking to the urban court, the army, and the Mediterranean world. In another, they appeared as pharaohs, linked to the gods, to temple benefaction, and to the old rhythms of Egyptian kingship. This double presentation was not accidental ornament. It was how the dynasty governed a country of more than one cultural language. Cleopatra's later mastery of image, ritual, and political symbolism did not arise from nowhere. It belonged to a world she had inherited, one in which rule meant embodying more than one tradition at the same time and convincing different audiences that the same monarch was fully theirs. Her early years, then, unfolded in surroundings that were probably magnificent in surface detail and deeply anxious underneath. The palace quarter of Alexandria would have offered luxury, attendance, instruction, and the constant spectacle of rank. But royal children in the Ptolemaic house grew up close to intrigue. They did not need to reach adulthood to sense danger. Every succession could become a contest. Every faction at court might align itself with one child against another. Every decision by the reigning king could produce resentment among soldiers, priests, Greek elites, Alexandrian crowds, or foreign creditors. The line between domestic dispute and national crisis was perilously thin. In that atmosphere, a princess learned quickly that family life and state life were the same thing. The year 58 BC brought that underlying fragility into the open. Rome annexed Cyprus, where Ptolemy XII's brother ruled, and the event helped expose how vulnerable the Egyptian king had become. In Alexandria, anger grew against Ptolemy XII, whose policies and Roman dependence had already damaged his standing. He fled Egypt in that year and went into exile, leaving the kingdom behind him. For a ruler who had spent so much to secure Roman favor, the sight of his own throne slipping away must have been bitterly instructive. For Cleopatra, who was still a child, it marked the moment when instability ceased to be an atmosphere and became an event. The king was gone, the capital unsettled, and the dynasty had again turned inward against itself. In his absence, Cleopatra's elder sister Berenice IV took power in Alexandria and ruled during the exile from 58 to 55 BC. That fact alone reveals much about the world Cleopatra inhabited. A daughter of the dynasty could seize the center when the father fell, and legitimacy would then be fought over not in theory, but in practice. The throne was not an abstract inheritance waiting patiently for legal settlement. It was occupied by whoever could command recognition, support, and force. We do not know exactly how the young Cleopatra experienced these years, but she lived through a lesson that would matter all her life. A Ptolemaic ruler who lost the capital could lose everything, and family members were often the first to step into the vacuum. There is a quiet severity in imagining the impression this must have made on a girl not yet grown. Her father, the king, had not proved immovable. Her sister had become queen in his place. Roman decisions had helped shape the crisis, but Roman aid had not instantly prevented it. The dynasty that presented itself as God-touch was exposed as vulnerable to mobs, factions, debt, and foreign leverage. Such experiences could harden a mind early. They could teach that rank without strategy was helpless, that ritual without force was brittle, and that survival depended on understanding both the palace and the wider Mediterranean world beyond it. The future Cleopatra would show exactly those instincts. Their roots belong here, in the sight of a family crown rocking on an unstable head. Meanwhile, Egypt itself remained more than a passive stage for dynastic quarrels. The old religious life of the country endured with remarkable force, and the temples remained important centers of local authority, wealth, and continuity. The Ptolemies had long supported Egyptian cults and priesthoods, even as they governed in Greek forms, because no ruler could afford to ignore the sacred foundations of kingship in the Nile Valley. Cleopatra was born into that long accommodation. It was one thing for Alexandria to admire Greek learning and Mediterranean elegance. It was another thing to rule Egypt without understanding what pharaonic authority meant to those beyond the capital. Even before Cleopatra consciously fashioned herself as a ruler, she belonged to a monarchy that survived by moving between those worlds. And all the while Rome stood near. In these same decades, the Roman Republic was not a distant, settled empire, but a restless and competitive state whose leading men turned eastern kingdoms into arenas of influence. Support from Rome could restore a king, but it could also burden him with debt and humiliation. Friendship with Roman commanders was never purely personal. It was structural, transactional, and dangerous. Ptolemy XII's dependence on Roman backing meant that Cleopatra's earliest political inheritance was not simple sovereignty, but entanglement. Egypt was rich enough to attract Roman attention, weak enough to need Roman help, and proud enough to resent both facts at once. That tension would define Cleopatra's adult life, but it was already present before she had any formal power of her own. When Ptolemy XII finally returned in 55 BC, he did not come home by his own strength. He was restored with Roman military backing under Aulus Gabinius after promises of vast payment. Restoration saved the king, but deepened the pattern of dependence that had helped bring Egypt to crisis in the first place. Once back in power, he executed Berenice IV, the daughter who had ruled in his absence. The recovery of the throne was therefore also an act of family destruction. For Cleopatra, still young but surely old enough now to understand something of consequence, the meaning could hardly have been missed. In her dynasty, exile could be reversed. Roman intervention could decide succession, and a father restored to kingship might answer rebellion with the death of his own child. Such episodes gave the last years of her childhood a particular moral weather. The court had been taught not to trust permanence. The king had returned, but not cleansed of weakness. The dynasty had survived, but at a cost in money, prestige, and blood. Egypt was still independent in name, still ruled from Alexandria, still crowned in ancient forms, yet the terms of that independence had narrowed, and everyone near the center of power must have known it. Cleopatra's later confidence can sometimes make her beginnings seem inevitable, as though greatness naturally advanced toward its hour. In truth, her beginnings were shadowed by the opposite lesson. Nothing in her world was guaranteed to last. By the end of this first period of her life, from her birth in 69 BC to the restoration of her father in 55 and the unsettled years that followed, the essential pattern was already visible. Cleopatra belonged to a dynasty of immense prestige and diminishing security. She was born in one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean, yet into a royal house haunted by questions of legitimacy, succession, and foreign dependence. She inherited both the symbolic wealth of pharaonic Egypt and the political precarity of a Hellenistic monarchy living under Roman pressure. Before she had spoken in the councils of government, before she had stood before Caesar or Antony, before she had claimed power in her own name, the world around her had already taught its first hard truths: that a throne could be lost, that blood ties offered no safety, and that Egypt's fate was no longer decided by Egyptians alone. That is why Cleopatra's story does not truly begin with romance, conquest, or legend. It begins with instability. It begins in a palace city where Greek and Egyptian traditions met under a fragile crown. It begins with a father who needed Rome, a kingdom rich enough to tempt stronger powers, and a family accustomed to turning on itself. The child born into that setting would one day become the last and most famous ruler of her line. But in these early years there was no sign of inevitability, only inheritance. a dangerous inheritance of wealth, ritual, intelligence, debt, ambition, and fear. From those materials, Cleopatra's life would be made. During the years when her father was absent from Egypt, Cleopatra was passing from childhood into early youth in a city unlike any other in the Mediterranean. Alexandria, for all its unrest and factional danger, remained one of the great intellectual capitals of the Hellenistic world. Under the Ptolemies, it had become a place where scholarship, science, poetry, administration, and royal display gathered in unusual concentration. Its famous institutions, including the museum and the library, had long made it a center of Greek learning, while its harbors and streets connected Egypt not only to the Nile Valley, but to the wider sea. Cleopatra's education took shape in that setting, where knowledge was not detached from power, but part of the atmosphere of rule itself. If the first section of her life was marked by instability, the second was marked by observation. She was not yet queen, but she was growing up close enough to power to see its true mechanics. Her father's exile had shown that kingship could collapse. Her sister Berenice's seizure of authority had shown that a daughter of the dynasty could occupy the throne when the center gave way. The return of Ptolemy XII, won with Roman military help and purchased by immense promises, revealed something else that would stay with Cleopatra all her life. Power did not rest on ceremony alone. It depended on alliances, money, calculation, and the ability to speak to more than one audience at once. Alexandria was a fitting school for such lessons because it was itself a meeting place of worlds. Greek remained the language of the court and much of elite administration, and the Ptolemaic dynasty had generally preserved Greek cultural habits with striking persistence. Yet the kingdom they ruled was still Egypt, anchored in older traditions, older priesthoods, and older understandings of sacred monarchy than anything the Macedonian conquerors had brought with them. Cleopatra grew up in the space between these inheritances. Unlike most of her forebears, she would later become known for learning Egyptian as well as other languages, a fact that has often been taken as evidence not only of intelligence but of unusual political instinct. Even before she came to power, the shape of her world would have made clear that a ruler who could move between cultures possessed an advantage that mere birth could not guarantee. Her formal education was almost certainly extensive, though the details cannot be recovered in full. A princess of the Ptolemaic court would have been trained in Greek language and literature, royal etiquette, religion, administration, and the arts of speech. She came from a dynasty that valued display and cultivated prestige through learning as well as wealth. Cleopatra herself was later remembered for fluency in several languages and for an ability to converse directly with many different peoples without interpreters. Ancient testimony on the exact number of languages varies, and some later retellings likely exaggerate, but the broad point is widely accepted. She was intellectually gifted, rhetorically trained, and unusually able to use language as an instrument of rule. That reputation does not belong only to legend. It fits the city in which she was raised and the political conditions she inherited. What mattered in Alexandria was not learning for its own sake alone, though the city certainly cherished that ideal. It was also learning as prestige, learning as diplomacy, learning as a mark of cultivated rule. The old Ptolemaic capital had been built not merely as a seat of government, but as a monument to the claims of the dynasty within the Greek-speaking world. The great scholars associated with Alexandria gave it brilliance, but they also helped make the city a symbol of civilized authority. To grow up there was to absorb the idea that intellect could be performed, that knowledge could legitimize power, and that words mattered in politics not as decoration but as force. Cleopatra's later command of ceremony and speech seems less surprising when placed against that background. The years of her father's exile would also have sharpened her awareness of faction. Court politics in Alexandria were rarely calm, and the absence of the king did not leave behind a peaceful void. It opened space for rivalry among royal claimants, courtiers, urban groups, and those whose interests were tied to one branch of the dynasty rather than another. Cleopatra may still have been young, but royal children did not need formal office to feel the pressure of such struggles. They lived among attendants, tutors, relatives, and officials, who all understood that succession could change lives overnight. A princess learned quickly whom to trust, how people attached themselves to power, and how swiftly public loyalty could shift when the throne itself was uncertain. In these years, she would also have been absorbing the very particular character of Alexandrian society. The city was cosmopolitan, layered, argumentative, and self-conscious. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others lived within its orbit, not as a smooth harmony, but as a complicated urban order shaped by law, privilege, commerce, and tension. The royal court stood above that world while also depending on it. A ruler in Alexandria had to understand not only the old symbols of kingship, but the moods of the capital whose crowds could matter politically. The city was both a jewel and a danger. It could magnify royal splendor, but it could also become a place of agitation and resistance, as her father had already discovered. For Cleopatra, the lesson was plain. A monarch who did not know how cities think would rule blindly. One should not imagine her youth as uninterrupted study in quiet halls. This was not the sheltered education of a child removed from consequence. It was the formation of someone born close to a throne whose foundations had already begun to crack. The restoration of Ptolemy XII in 55 BC, backed by Roman force, must have left a deep impression. Rome had not merely influenced events from afar, it had entered the Egyptian succession directly. Aulus Gabinius, acting from Roman Syria, brought the army that returned her father to Alexandria after promises of enormous payment. The restored king then eliminated Berenice IV, confirming that clemency could not be expected inside the dynasty when power had been contested. Cleopatra's adolescence unfolded after this grim demonstration of what restoration really meant. The Roman dimension of her education deserves special weight because it was not theoretical. During these same decades, the Roman Republic was being transformed by rivalry among immensely ambitious men. Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, and their circles were not merely distant names. Their decisions shaped the Eastern Mediterranean, and kings like Ptolemy XII lived or fell according to how successfully they navigated Roman politics. Cleopatra grew up in a kingdom that remained formally independent but was increasingly entangled in the affairs of the Republic. She would have understood, long before she wielded power in her own name, that Egypt's future could not be secured by looking only south along the Nile. It also required an exact reading of forces across the sea. That early awareness may help explain the quality later generations noticed in her. Not simply intelligence, but strategic intelligence. She did not emerge suddenly, fully formed when she met Caesar. She had been prepared by years of exposure to a court where every domestic dispute had an international edge. Even the most personal questions of dynastic life were touched by Roman power. Who would rule? Who would marry? Who would be recognized? Who would be restored? And at what price? These were not purely Egyptian matters anymore, for a keen young woman raised in the palace. Such conditions would have encouraged habits of attention. She had reason to listen carefully, to remember names, to learn how alliances were spoken into being, and to understand that the visible ceremony of monarchy was only the outer layer of rule. The city around her reinforced those habits. Alexandria's prestige as a place of books and scholarship was real, but so too was its role as an administrative machine. Egypt under the Ptolemies had long maintained a powerful bureaucracy capable of managing taxation, agriculture, trade, and royal revenues at a high level of complexity. A princess raised in such a state was not merely inheriting mythic pharaonic images. She was inheriting files, grain accounts, decrees, offices, interpreters, military concerns, and temple relationships. Education for rule in this world could not have been purely literary. It would have involved some understanding, whether direct or gradually acquired, of how government functioned in practice. Cleopatra's later effectiveness as an administrator suggests that she learned these matters early and learned them well. Her relationship to language belonged to this practical education too. The Ptolemies had generally remained Greek-speaking rulers over a largely Egyptian land. That separation gave them continuity as a dynasty, but it also imposed distance. Cleopatra's later fame for speaking Egyptian and other languages therefore stands out against family custom. It suggests a mind willing to close gaps that her predecessors had often left open. During her youth, as she encountered both courtly Greek culture and the realities of Egyptian kingship, She may have begun to understand that language itself could be a political bridge. To speak to priests, envoys, subjects, and foreign visitors in their own tongues was to reduce dependence on intermediaries and to gain control over nuance. For someone who would one day have to survive among stronger powers, that was no small gift. There was also, no doubt, a personal dimension to this intellectual formation. Cleopatra was born into a family of repeated names and unstable bonds, where daughters and sons alike could become rivals, spouses, symbols, or casualties. In such a household, the development of inner resources mattered. Learning, memory, eloquence, and self-command were not only ornaments of royalty, they were means of defining oneself in a court that could otherwise reduce a princess to a marriage arrangement or a pawn in succession. The available evidence does not permit romantic inventions about her private thoughts, but it does permit a reasonable conclusion. A gifted young woman raised amid dynastic danger would have understood that her mind was one of the few forms of power that could become unmistakably her own. As Ptolemy XII resumed his reign after Roman-backed restoration, Cleopatra was entering the years in which observation turns toward preparation. Her father's position had been saved, but not strengthened in any deep sense. The dependence remained, the memory of exile remained, the example of Berenice remained. What had changed was that Cleopatra was now old enough to read these events not merely as shocks, but as patterns. She could see that Rome intervened where weakness invited it. She could see that legitimacy required recognition as well as blood. She could see that public image, military backing, and financial capacity all belonged to the same political fabric. This was the education beneath the visible education, and it may have mattered most of all. It is tempting to picture her in the shadow of the library, nourished by scrolls and disputation, and there is truth in that image so far as Alexandria really was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. But the more important point is that in Cleopatra's case, intellectual refinement and political formation were inseparable. The city taught her the prestige of culture. Her family taught her the danger of power. Rome taught her the scale of the world beyond Egypt. Together, these influences produced not a scholar removed from action, but a future ruler trained to think, speak, and adapt under pressure. By 51 BC, when Ptolemy XII died and Cleopatra was about 18 years old, the period of preparation had come to an end. According to Britannica, he left the kingdom jointly to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, in keeping with dynastic custom. That arrangement would soon open into conflict. But before the struggle, there had been these formative years of exile and return, of study and watching, of language and courtly theater, of Alexandria's brilliance and Egypt's vulnerability. They did not make her future safe. They made her ready for a world in which safety scarcely existed. So this second stage of Cleopatra's life was less dramatic than the famous chapters to come, but in some ways more revealing. Here, the elements of her later power were assembled. She learned in a city built on prestige, under a father preserved by foreign intervention, within a dynasty that devoured its own, and beside a sea that carried Roman power ever closer to Egypt's shores. She learned that intelligence could be an instrument, that rhetoric could shape allegiance, that identity itself could be made expansive rather than narrow. When she finally stepped into rule, she would do so not as a sheltered heir surprised by danger, but as a young queen already familiar with the hard grammar of survival. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, the years of preparation ended abruptly, and the years of action began. Cleopatra was about 18, old enough to understand the kingdom she inherited and young enough still to be tested by it at once. In keeping with Ptolemaic custom, the throne passed jointly to her and her much younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. It is widely thought they may also have been married according to dynastic practice. Though that point is not certain, what is clearer is that Cleopatra, older than her brother by about 8 years, appears at first to have been the dominant figure in the new arrangement. The early balance of power leaned toward her, and for a brief moment it may have seemed possible that she would rule in substance while preserving the formal language of co-rule. This system of sibling rule had deep roots in the Ptolemaic dynasty, but it had rarely produced calm. The custom was intended to preserve legitimacy within the royal house, to keep power concentrated and the dynastic line unbroken. In practice, it often produced the opposite. Rivalry sharpened by intimacy, formal partnership masking a contest for survival. Brothers and sisters who shared titles did not necessarily share authority. A royal marriage did not dissolve political competition. Cleopatra stepped into a pattern that had already destroyed trust within her family for generations. To inherit such a structure was to inherit conflict in ceremonial dress. At first, Cleopatra seems to have acted with unusual directness. Evidence from the opening phase of the reign suggests that she did not present herself as a passive junior partner waiting for courtiers to arrange her future. Britannica notes that she was the dominant ruler early on, before the order of names in official documents shifted in favor of Ptolemy XIII by October of 50 BC. That small documentary change carries the weight of a larger reality. It suggests that during the first year after their father's death, the struggle for control was already underway, and that Cleopatra's initial advantage was slipping. What had begun as co-rule was hardening into opposition. The reasons for that shift lay partly in the nature of the court around the young king. Ptolemy XIII was still a boy, and boys on thrones attract guardians, advisors, and ambitious intermediaries. Ancient accounts and modern summaries alike place great influence in the hands of men such as Pothinus, the eunuch regent, the rhetorician, the Adotus of Chios, and the general Achilles. These figures understood that a capable young queen was far less manageable than a child king through whom others might rule. Cleopatra's independence, intelligence, and willingness to act in her own name were strengths in one sense and dangers in another. For those who hoped to dominate the government, she was an obstacle. The court around her brother increasingly became a court organized against her. There were larger pressures too. Egypt remained strategically essential in the eastern Mediterranean, not only because of its wealth, but because of its grain, its harbors, and its position between worlds. Rome had not yet annexed the kingdom, but Roman influence remained close and heavy. Cleopatra inherited not a free field in which to consolidate power quietly, but a throne already shadowed by foreign expectations and domestic memory. Her father had returned only because Roman force had restored him. The debts, resentments, and precedents left by that restoration were still alive. Any contest inside the royal house took place in the knowledge that Egypt's weakness would not remain a purely Egyptian matter for long. To rule under such conditions required not only legitimacy, but presence. Cleopatra seems to have understood this from the beginning. Later tradition would remember her chiefly through her famous alliances with Roman leaders. But before those alliances came her first effort to establish herself as ruler in her own right. Her upbringing in Alexandria, her command of language, and her experience of court politics had prepared her to act rather than simply endure. Even in the fragmentary record, one can sense that she did not intend to disappear behind the person of her brother. This was the first great test of the political identity formed during her youth, whether she could translate intelligence and royal status into durable power. For the moment she could not, but the struggle itself revealed the kind of ruler she was becoming. By about 50 or 49 BC, the pressure became too great. Cleopatra was forced out of the center of power and eventually out of Egypt itself. Britannica summarizes the matter plainly. She quarreled until she was forced to flee around 50 BC. World History Encyclopedia places the decisive break in 48 BC, describing how Pothinus, Theodotus, and Achilles overthrew her and elevated Ptolemy XIII as the more controllable ruler. The exact rhythm of the separation is not perfectly preserved in every source, but the broad shape is clear. Cleopatra lost Alexandria. Her brother's faction gained the court. The contest moved from hidden struggle within the palace to open rivalry over the kingdom itself. Exile was not only a personal humiliation. In the Ptolemaic world, it was often the threshold between extinction and reinvention. To be driven from the capital was to lose access to treasury, bureaucracy, ritual, and the symbolic heart of kingship. Yet exile could also clarify a claimant's position. No longer constrained by the daily manipulations of hostile courtiers, Cleopatra was forced to become something more sharply defined. An independent contender for the throne, the habits learned in youth now had to become practical strategy. She was no longer simply the elder royal partner edged aside by palace intrigue. She was a ruler without a city, a queen without secure possession of her kingdom, and therefore a political actor who had to create support rather than inherit it. Her displacement also exposed the deeper weakness of dynastic custom. Joint rule was supposed to preserve continuity. Instead, it had created two courts, two centers of loyalty, and two futures that could not coexist. Cleopatra's brother, because of his age, became the vessel for those who wished to dominate policy from behind the throne. Cleopatra, because of her experience and force of character, became the rival who could not be safely contained. The arrangement had been unstable from the beginning, not because either sibling was unusually unnatural, but because the political structure itself invited capture by factions. In that sense, Cleopatra's fall from power was not an accident. It was the expected flowering of a diseased inheritance. What followed is one of the most important transitions in her life. Rather than vanish into obscurity, she began to gather an independent base of support. Ancient and modern accounts place her outside the capital, moving toward the eastern frontier and the regions from which a return might be organized. World History Encyclopedia says that Cleopatra and her half-sister Arsinoe IV fled to safety, and that Cleopatra later raised an army in Syria to reclaim her throne. However one reconstructs the precise route and timing, the essential fact remains that she did not accept deposition as final. She acted like a dispossessed monarch preparing restoration. This mattered greatly. Many royal women of the ancient world were remembered as figures moved by others. Cleopatra, even before Caesar entered her story, had already begun to move pieces of her own. There is something stark and revealing in that image. The young queen, cut off from Alexandria, looking eastward for men, money, and military backing. Egypt's fate had long been tied to larger Mediterranean networks, and now Cleopatra herself entered those networks directly as a claimant in search of force. Exile taught quickly. It stripped away the illusion that dynastic blood by itself could secure obedience. It proved that a queen might need soldiers before she could reclaim ceremony. It also placed her in the same political logic that had shaped her father's career. When domestic authority failed, restoration depended on support gathered beyond the immediate center of the kingdom. But Cleopatra was not merely repeating her father's pattern. She was adapting it with a sharper personal will and a clearer sense of what was at stake. Egypt's importance to Rome gave all this a wider significance. The kingdom was not just another contested throne. It mattered because whoever controlled Egypt controlled enormous resources in a period when Roman politics had become deeply unstable. By the late 40s BC, the Republic itself was in civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. That conflict would soon spill directly into Alexandrian affairs. But even before the decisive encounter, Egypt's dynastic crisis was taking shape beside a much larger Roman storm. Cleopatra and her brother were struggling over a crown in a kingdom whose wealth and strategic position made it impossible for the Roman world to remain indifferent for long. Her personal exile was unfolding within an international vacuum of authority. This is what gives Section 3 of her life its distinct tone. It is not yet the era of legendary seduction or imperial display. It is a harsher, tenser moment. Cleopatra is not at her most adorned, but at her most exposed. She has inherited the throne but cannot keep it peacefully. She has the stronger mind, yet finds herself displaced by the machinery of the court. She has royal legitimacy, but legitimacy alone proves fragile against regents, generals, and administrators clustered around a boy king. In these years, survival becomes the central theme. Not survival in the passive sense of hiding from danger, but survival as an active art, preserving claim, building allies, and waiting for the opening through which power can be seized again. One can also see here the emergence of Cleopatra's political solitude. She belonged to the dynasty, yet the dynasty did not protect her. She shared rule with her brother, yet brotherhood became opposition. She possessed rank, but rank failed to command the court once the regency circle turned against her. The old forms remained in place around her even as their substance decayed. This must have clarified the nature of power in a way no tutor could have done. Institutions mattered, titles mattered, ancestry mattered, but in the end they only held so long as one could animate them with real support. Cleopatra's exile was therefore also an education in realism. It taught her what symbols could not do, and yet exile did not diminish her stature in the story of her own life. It enlarged it. A ruler who has never lost power may never fully understand it. Cleopatra, before she ever stood before Caesar, learned what it meant to be excluded, outmaneuvered, and forced to begin again with fewer tools than her enemies possessed. That experience would later help explain her daring. People who imagine Cleopatra only in terms of glamour miss how much of her character was shaped by these years of displacement and necessity. She was not simply brilliant in triumph. She was formative in adversity. By the eve of Caesar's arrival in Egypt in 48 BC, the lines had been drawn. Ptolemy XIII's faction held Alexandria. Cleopatra remained outside the capital, armed with claim, resolve, and a growing capacity to act independently. The kingdom was divided not just between siblings but between political visions. One centered on control of the child king by palace advisors, the other on the return of the elder queen as a sovereign force in her own right. Rome's civil war was moving eastward, and Egypt's internal struggle was about to be folded into a conflict larger than either sibling could master alone. The next phase of Cleopatra's life would begin when these two crises met. So her ascension was never a simple ascent. It began with inheritance, passed almost immediately into rivalry, and turned through exile into self-creation. The daughter shaped by Alexandria's learning and her father's failures now faced the first full measure of danger in her own name. She had lost the capital, but not the contest. She had been driven out, but not erased. In the hard space between deposition and return, Cleopatra first became unmistakably herself, not merely a princess of the Ptolemaic house, but a claimant willing to endure uncertainty, gather strength beyond the court, and fight for Egypt as though the throne were something to be won rather than merely received. By the time Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, Cleopatra's struggle with her brother had already become a contest for survival. She was outside the center of power, building support after being forced from Alexandria, while Ptolemy XIII remained in the capital under the control of advisors who governed in his name. At that same moment, the Roman world was convulsed by civil war. Caesar had defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and Pompey had fled eastward seeking refuge. Egypt, because of its wealth and strategic importance, could not remain untouched by that conflict. The kingdom that Cleopatra and her brother were fighting over was about to become the setting for a meeting between Roman civil war and Ptolemaic collapse. Pompey reached Egypt first, hoping perhaps that old ties with the house of Ptolemy XII would protect him. Instead, advisors around Ptolemy XIII chose to murder him, calculating that such a gesture would please Caesar. It was the kind of decision that revealed the degraded political atmosphere of the late Ptolemaic court, fearful, opportunistic, and eager to manage Roman power by theatrical cruelty. Caesar did not respond with gratitude. Ancient and later accounts alike remember the killing as an act that disgusted him, even if political calculations still guided all that followed. When he entered Alexandria, he did so not merely as a Roman victor passing through, but as a man now drawn into Egypt's dynastic crisis. Caesar's presence changed the scale of everything. Cleopatra's quarrel with her brother had been grave enough already. But now, one of the most powerful men in the Roman world stood in Alexandria, carrying with him both military force and political legitimacy of a kind no Ptolemaic faction could ignore. Caesar intended to settle matters in accordance with the will of Ptolemy XII, which had named Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII joint rulers. That decision did not arise from sentiment. Egypt mattered too much for Caesar to allow it to dissolve into uncontrollable disorder. A stable monarchy, dependent on Roman favor and aligned with his own interests, was preferable to prolonged chaos. For Cleopatra, this was the opening she had needed. The most famous moment in this turning point is also the one most covered by later legend: Cleopatra's secret meeting with Caesar. Ancient tradition, especially as carried through later retellings, tells of her being brought into Caesar's presence, concealed in bedding or a sack of linens, an image that has endured because it captures so much in a single scene. Whether every detail was exactly as later writers described, the broader truth is secure. Cleopatra gained private access to Caesar at a moment when ordinary procedure would have favored her enemies. The act was bold, theatrical, and intensely practical. It showed not only courage, but a shrewd understanding of how power works in moments of crisis. When formal channels are controlled by rivals, one must create a new entrance. It is easy, because of everything that followed, to read this encounter purely as romance. But first it was politics. Cleopatra had been displaced by a court faction ruling through her younger brother. Caesar needed leverage in Egypt and a lawful basis for intervention. Their meeting joined two urgent interests. Cleopatra offered legitimacy, intelligence, and a route toward a settlement favorable to Caesar. Caesar offered military backing, authority, and the possibility of restoration. Attraction may have grown quickly between them, and later sources make clear that they became lovers. But the bond began in the hard light of mutual advantage. Cleopatra did not arrive before Caesar as a passive supplicant. She arrived as a claimant who understood that survival required alignment with the strongest available force. That alignment brought immediate danger. Caesar's decision to support the settlement restoring Cleopatra alongside her brother provoked the Alexandrian War, a fierce struggle fought in and around the city. Caesar, with only a limited force at first, found himself besieged by the army loyal to Ptolemy XIII's faction. What followed was not a serene political correction, but a dangerous military confrontation in the heart of Alexandria. Britannica notes that Caesar and Cleopatra spent the winter besieged there, with the balance unresolved until Roman reinforcements arrived the following spring. For Cleopatra, restoration did not come as a gift laid gently at her feet. It came through fire, siege, and the uncertain fortunes of war. Alexandria, the city that had formed her mind, now became the battleground on which her future would be decided. The war was a civil conflict within Egypt, but it was also inseparable from Roman power. Caesar's presence transformed a dynastic dispute into an episode of Roman intervention, and the fighting revealed again how little independent space remained for the late Ptolemaic kingdom. Egypt still had kings and queens, but their fate could now hinge on the campaigns of Roman generals. Even so, this is not a story in which Cleopatra was merely carried along by events. She had maneuvered herself into Caesar's camp, and that decision proved decisive. The kingdom was being fought over by armies, but it was also being won by judgment. One of the most enduring side stories of the war concerns the burning of part of the Alexandrian library collections. Britannica notes that in 48 BC, during Caesar's involvement in the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, he set fire to the enemy fleet in the Great Harbor, and that the royal library was an unfortunate casualty of war. The scale of the damage and its long-term implications remain debated, and later memory often magnified the event into a symbol of civilizational loss. Yet even the possibility is fitting in a grim way. Alexandria, city of learning and power, was once again shown to be vulnerable at its very center when dynastic weakness and imperial conflict met. The war around Cleopatra's restoration was not only personal or military. It also wounded the cultural world that had helped shape her. The decisive turn came with the arrival of reinforcements for Caesar. The siege was broken, and Ptolemy XIII fled. Britannica states that he drowned in the Nile in 47 BC while leading forces against Caesar. With his death, the immediate military threat to Cleopatra's restoration collapsed. The faction that had driven her from power was broken. The young brother with whom she had once been expected to share rule was gone, swallowed by the same struggle that had made coexistence impossible from the start. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, joint sovereignty had once again ended not in balance, but in blood. After the war, Cleopatra was restored to her throne. Formally, the old dynastic structure was preserved through a new arrangement. She was now associated with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. This outward continuity mattered. Caesar did not abolish the Ptolemaic monarchy. He restabilized it in a form useful to Roman interests, while leaving Cleopatra in the commanding position. That distinction is important. Cleopatra returned not as an independent victor who had expelled all outside influence, but as a queen restored through Roman force and bound, for the moment, to Caesar's protection. Yet within those limits, she had achieved something extraordinary. She had gone from exile to rule again by acting with timing, audacity, and political intelligence, at exactly the moment when Egypt's internal crisis opened into Roman history. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar deepened in the aftermath of war. Ancient and modern sources agree that they became lovers. For later Roman writers, this fact offered endless material for moral judgment and political hostility. Cleopatra could be portrayed as an Eastern temptress, Caesar as compromised by foreign luxury, and their connection as a sign of monarchical corruption. But beneath the hostile language of later tradition, the political significance remains clearer than the scandal. Caesar had restored her. She had become his ally in one of the most valuable kingdoms of the Mediterranean. Their personal intimacy strengthened a political partnership that was already profound. Cleopatra had found in Caesar not simply a protector, but a world historical force through whom Egypt might yet preserve a measure of autonomy under Roman shadow, rather than disappear immediately into Roman possession. In June of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesarion, or Little Caesar. Britannica notes both his birth date and the central uncertainty that has always attended him. Whether Julius Caesar was truly his father cannot now be known with certainty, though Cleopatra clearly presented him as such, and his very name pointed in that direction. For Cleopatra, the child represented much more than maternity. He embodied a political possibility. If recognized as Caesar's son, he joined Egyptian dynastic continuity to the most powerful name in the Roman world. In him, Cleopatra could imagine not merely survival, but a refounding of legitimacy on a grander scale than the old Ptolemaic house alone could offer. Caesarion's birth changed the symbolic horizon of Cleopatra's reign. Before Caesar, her struggle had been to recover the throne against her brother's faction. With Caesarion, the future could be imagined differently. The child suggested an alliance of blood, or at least of claim, between Alexandria and Rome, between the last great Hellenistic monarchy and the man reshaping the Republic. That possibility was unstable from the beginning, because Roman politics would never easily accept a foreign queen and a potentially dynastic child hovering near Caesar's name. Yet from Cleopatra's perspective, the significance was immense. She had not only regained power, she had produced an heir around whom a new political mythology could gather. Some time after her restoration, Cleopatra traveled with Caesar and spent time in Rome, though the full weight of that phase belongs more fully to the next section. Even so, the meaning of her alliance with Caesar was already visible before she ever crossed the sea. Egypt had survived the succession crisis, but only by becoming more intimately entangled with Roman power than ever before. Cleopatra, however, was not diminished by that entanglement in any simple way. She had turned dependence into position. Where her father had leaned on Rome out of weakness and drifted into exile, Cleopatra had used Roman intervention with far greater precision. She had chosen her moment, secured direct access to the right man, and returned not as a rescued remnant of a fallen regime, but as an active partner in a new order. This was the truly transformative quality of the Caesar alliance. It did not merely restore what had been lost. It altered Cleopatra's scale. Before meeting Caesar, she had been one claimant among the last troubled generation of Ptolemaic rulers. After the Alexandrian War, she became a figure whose life was bound up with the fate of Rome's greatest commander. Her decisions now mattered not only within Egypt, but within the largest political drama of the Mediterranean. The young queen who had fought to regain Alexandria now stood at the edge of a wider historical role, one in which her kingdom, her body, her dynastic hopes, and her political image would all be scrutinized through Roman eyes. Yet the transformation was shadowed from the start. Cleopatra's restoration had come through civil war. Her brother was dead. Her rule remained dependent on a Roman whose own career was advancing toward greater concentration of power and greater danger. Caesarion's birth offered promise, but also invited future conflict over legitimacy and succession. Nothing about this new phase was secure. It was brilliant, charged, and full of possibility, but it rested on the fortunes of one extraordinary Roman man and on the willingness of Roman politics to tolerate what he had made possible in Egypt. Cleopatra had risen again, but she had risen into a world of larger hazards than before. So the alliance with Caesar marks the first great transformation in Cleopatra's life. Exile gave way to restoration. Local dynastic struggle widened into international consequence. A displaced queen became the partner of Julius Caesar and the mother of a child who might symbolize a new order. The famous meeting in Alexandria, the winter of siege, the defeat of Ptolemy XIII, and the birth of Caesarion all belong together as parts of one turning point. Cleopatra did not simply survive this crisis. She emerged from it enlarged, more dangerous, and more deeply written into the history of Rome and Egypt alike. From this moment forward, her life could no longer be told as the story of a threatened Ptolemaic ruler alone. It had become something larger, more radiant, and more precarious. The death of Julius Caesar in March of 44 BC broke the structure on which Cleopatra's recent fortunes had depended. For several years she had risen with his protection behind her, restored to power through his intervention and bound to him by political alliance, personal intimacy, and the birth of Caesarion. In Rome, where she had spent time during the later phase of Caesar's ascendancy, she had stood close enough to the center of power to imagine that Egypt's future might be secured through that connection. Then, in a single act of violence, the man around whom so much had been arranged was cut down in the Senate, and the world Cleopatra had been learning to inhabit shifted at once into danger and uncertainty. For Cleopatra, Caesar's assassination was not a distant Roman tragedy to be observed with sympathy. It was an immediate political emergency. Caesar had been the guarantor of her restored rule, and the only Roman whose personal authority was great enough to shield her position without requiring Egypt's full absorption into Roman control. His death meant that protection was gone. And it also meant that Caesarion's future became more fragile. The child had been presented as Caesar's son, and Cleopatra had clear reasons to build his legitimacy around that claim. But Rome was in no mood to welcome an Egyptian queen and a boy who might be seen, however implausibly, in strict Roman legal terms, as competing with Caesar's Roman heirs and successors. Cleopatra could not remain in the unsettled capital and trust that events would resolve themselves in her favor. She left Rome and returned to Egypt, taking Caesarion with her. The move was prudent, perhaps necessary. Rome in the aftermath of the assassination was a city of competing factions, fear, rumor, and rapidly shifting alliances. Men who claimed loyalty to Caesar were already beginning to position themselves for control, while his killers tried to justify the murder as an act of republican salvation. Cleopatra's place in that struggle was precarious. She was prominent enough to attract suspicion, and too foreign to be safely protected by sentiment alone. Egypt, though vulnerable, at least offered her a throne, a treasury, an administration, and a base from which she might think clearly about the future. Yet returning to Alexandria did not mean returning to simplicity. The same woman who had once used Roman intervention to recover her throne now had to govern while the Roman order around her was being violently remade. The question was no longer how to use Caesar's favor, but how to live after it. That required a recalibration of a very high order. Cleopatra needed to preserve her kingdom, secure her own position, protect Caesarion, and judge which Roman figures might become decisive in the struggles ahead. She had to do all this without the luxury of certainty, because in 44 BC, even Rome itself did not yet know who would emerge with lasting power. At home, she also had unfinished dynastic business. After her restoration in the wake of the Alexandrian War, Cleopatra had been formally associated in rule with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, in continuity with Ptolemaic custom. But such arrangements were rarely stable, and after Caesar's death, Ptolemy XIV soon disappeared from the political scene. Ancient tradition and later summaries strongly suggest that he was killed on Cleopatra's orders, or at least in her interest, though direct proof is elusive in the way it often is for palace deaths. What is clear is the outcome. Caesarion was elevated as her co-ruler, becoming Ptolemy XV. Cleopatra thus replaced a dynastic partner rooted in old Ptolemaic custom with a child whose significance depended on her own claim and on his association with Caesar. It was a decisive act of consolidation. This move reveals much about Cleopatra's political mind in the years between Caesar and Antony. She was not simply trying to hold the throne until events settled elsewhere. She was reshaping the structure of her rule around the strongest legitimizing symbol available to her. Caesarion linked her present to Caesar's memory and her future to a dynastic vision, broader than the old sibling pairings of the Ptolemaic house. In recognizing him as co-ruler, Cleopatra was also recognizing a truth about survival. In a dangerous world, legitimacy had to be made active. It had to be staged, named, proclaimed, and defended. A queen who had once been forced into exile by palace rivals was now taking care not to leave a dangerous alternate center of dynastic authority alive beside her. There is a darker steadiness in this phase of her life. The dramatic sweep of the Caesar years gave way to something more controlled and more inward. Cleopatra had already learned through her father, her siblings, and her own first exile that mercy was not a principle on which late Ptolemaic politics could depend. Now she governed accordingly. The elimination of rivals, or at least the narrowing of possible rivals, was not a departure from the logic of her world. It was an adaptation to it. The difference was that Cleopatra now carried out that logic with greater precision than many of her predecessors had managed. She was no longer a displaced claimant fighting to return. She was an established ruler pruning danger before it ripened. Even so, consolidation within Egypt could solve only part of her problem. Rome remained the true horizon against which all serious calculation had to be made. After Caesar's assassination, several of his allies and heirs moved to avenge him and to divide the Roman world among themselves. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed what became known as the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC, a legally sanctioned concentration of power meant to crush Caesar's assassins and restore order on terms favorable to the Caesarian faction. Their victories at Philippi in 42 BC over Brutus and Cassius removed the immediate Republican challenge. But they did not create peace. They created a new political map, one in which power was divided among strong men, and the eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt, fell increasingly within Antony's sphere. For Cleopatra, this changed the shape of Roman risk. During Caesar's life, one towering individual had stood above the field. After his death, the Roman world became a contest among several leaders whose alliances were contingent and whose ambitions were not yet compatible. Cleopatra could not afford to commit blindly, nor could she remain wholly detached. Egypt's independence was too fragile, its wealth too tempting, and her own past association with Caesar too significant for neutrality to be simple. She had to wait, watch, and interpret. Her policy in these years seems to have been one of guarded positioning rather than reckless intervention. Preserve Egypt's internal stability, maintain the monarchy, and avoid attaching herself too quickly to a Roman future not yet decided. That restraint was not passivity. It was strategic patience, and it suited the moment. Cleopatra knew by experience that Rome often settled questions of legitimacy only after great violence. She had seen one Roman civil war spill into her own kingdom, and she had no reason to think the next phase would be gentler. Her task was to survive the interval. This is what gives the years from 44 to 41 BC their particular tone. They are not years of dazzling initiative in the way the Caesar alliance had been, nor yet of opulent theatrical expansion like the Antony years to come. They are years of recalculation, of preserving gains won at high cost, and of adjusting to a Roman world in which the death of one patron could not be allowed to become the death of Egypt's autonomy. There may also have been practical pressures within Egypt itself that sharpened the need for careful government. World History Encyclopedia's timeline notes that the period after Caesar's assassination coincided with bad harvests, though the scale and immediate political effects require cautious handling. Still, even the possibility fits the broader reality. A ruler in Egypt could not live by dynastic image alone. Grain, taxation, and the rhythms of the Nile remained fundamental. Cleopatra's reputation in later summaries as a capable and effective ruler suggests that these years were not merely a political pause while she waited for the next Roman alliance. They were years in which she governed, stabilized, and strengthened her position at home, while the Mediterranean order rearranged itself abroad. What made this especially delicate was Caesarion's place in our plans. Cleopatra's ambition, as Britannica notes, was to make him Caesar's successor. even though in Rome Caesar's adopted heir was Octavian. That ambition could not be realized through blunt assertion. It had to be preserved in symbol, ceremony, and long-range possibility. Caesarion's co-rule mattered because it made him visible as more than a royal child. It placed him within the active structure of Egyptian sovereignty and kept alive a claim that might later be made more forceful if Roman circumstances allowed. Cleopatra was not in a position to win this argument openly in 44 or 43 BC, but she could keep the argument alive. Sometimes in history, survival depends less on immediate triumph than on refusing to surrender a future claim. By now, Cleopatra had become a different kind of ruler than the young queen who first ascended beside Ptolemy XIII. Then she had tried to dominate a joint monarchy and had been pushed into exile by a hostile court. Now, she ruled with harder knowledge. She knew the cost of allowing rivals to gather around a symbolic king. She knew that foreign alliances could restore power, but also entangle it. She knew that the public face of legitimacy had to be matched by ruthless attention to structure. The woman who returned to Egypt after Caesar's death was not merely bereaved or endangered. She was seasoned. The uncertainty around her did not diminish her capacity. It called it into sharper use. As the triumviral order took shape, the Eastern Mediterranean increasingly came under the influence of Mark Antony. That development would soon matter enormously. But before Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BC to answer questions about her conduct in the aftermath of Caesar's murder, there was this intermediate phase in which she held her kingdom together and positioned herself for what was coming. Britannica notes that Antony sent for her precisely so she might explain her role after the assassination, which suggests that even her caution had not exempted her from Roman scrutiny. Egypt could not hide behind distance. Its queen remained too significant, too wealthy, and too closely associated with Caesar for that. So these years between Rome and Egypt were defined by suspended judgment. Cleopatra had to live in two political worlds at once. In Egypt, she was restoring clarity, elevating Caesarion, narrowing dynastic danger, and reinforcing the image of stable monarchy. In relation to Rome, she was wading through volatility, watching Caesar's heirs and avengers battle for preeminence, measuring which alliances might endure, and avoiding a fatal misstep while the old republic gave way to new forms of concentrated rule. The famous later chapters of her life can sometimes make this interval seem transitional in a minor sense, but it was not minor. It was the bridge between the Caesar alliance and the Antony alliance, and bridges are dangerous places. One misjudgment there, and all that had been won can be lost. By 41 BC, the waiting was nearly over. The Roman world had not stabilized in any lasting moral sense, but it had clarified enough that Antony now stood before Cleopatra as the dominant Roman in the East. Just as Caesar had once stood above the field in an earlier moment, Cleopatra had survived the vacuum after Caesar's death, returned to Alexandria, secured Caesarion as co-ruler, and preserved Egypt through one of the most dangerous intervals of her reign. She had not solved the Roman problem. No ruler of Egypt could solve it by then. But she had avoided being crushed by it, and that alone was a remarkable achievement. The next stage of her life would require not caution, but brilliance of a different order. Performance, alliance, and ambition, on a scale that matched the transformed Roman world. When Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BC, he did so from a position of authority. After the defeat of Brutus and Cassius, the Roman world had been divided among the triumvirs, and Antony had taken charge of the East. Egypt, wealthy and strategically placed, lay within the sphere he now needed to stabilize. Cleopatra was called to answer questions about her conduct during the recent Roman upheavals, including accusations that she had not adequately supported the Caesarian cause and may have had dealings with its enemies. The summons was not a casual invitation. It was a test, and perhaps an opportunity for humiliation if handled badly. But Cleopatra had lived too long under Roman shadow to mistake such moments for simple danger. She understood that a summons from the dominant Roman in the East could also become an opening through which power might be remade. Tarsus itself stood at a point of passage between worlds, a fitting place for such a meeting. It was a city of Cilicia, long linked to imperial movement and Eastern administration. and by the 1st century BC it was a natural stage for the encounter of Roman command and Hellenistic monarchy. Cleopatra did not arrive there in fear alone. Later accounts preserve the famous image of her approach up the Cydnus River on a richly adorned barge, framed in luxury and divine imagery, presenting herself not merely as a queen responding to interrogation, but as a sovereign in full command of symbolism. The details have passed through ancient literary shaping, but the essential truth is persuasive. Cleopatra turned the meeting into theater because theater was one of the most efficient instruments of politics in her world. Antony wished to evaluate a client queen. Cleopatra made certain that he would instead meet a ruler whose wealth, intelligence, and self-presentation could not be reduced to subordination. This first meeting with Antony has often been wrapped in the language of irresistible romance, and there is no need to deny the force of attraction between them. Yet, as with Caesar before him, politics came first. Antony needed money, supplies, and dependable Eastern allies for the struggles that still lay ahead, including his ambitions against Parthia and his continuing rivalry within the Roman order. Cleopatra needed security, recognition, and a Roman partner strong enough to deter threats to her throne while allowing Egypt to remain under her control rather than be swallowed outright, their needs matched with unusual precision. The personal element, however real, only deepened a relationship already rooted in mutual advantage. Cleopatra did not come to Tarsus seeking affection for its own sake. She came to secure Egypt's future through alignment with the man who now mattered most in the Eastern Mediterranean. Antony, for his part, was not Caesar, and the difference mattered. Caesar had an austere, concentrated authority, and Cleopatra's alliance with him had grown out of civil war and restoration. Antony brought another style entirely. He was charismatic, theatrical, expansive, and deeply responsive to display. Ancient and later writers often contrasted him with Octavian in terms that made him seem larger, warmer, more impulsive, and more drawn to the splendors of the East. Whether or not every contrast is fair, Cleopatra would have recognized quickly that Antony was a man to whom magnificence could speak. Her presentation at Tarsus was therefore not superficial ornament. It was a highly intelligent reading of character. She met Antony not in Roman plainness, but in a language of abundance, myth, and royal allure that suited both his temperament and her own political method. The result was immediate. Antony was won over, and he followed Cleopatra back to Egypt, spending the winter of 41 to 40 BC with her in Alexandria. Britannica notes that her long liaison with Mark Antony began when she visited him at Tarsus in 41 BC, and he returned to Egypt with her. This was not a trivial episode of diversion. It marked the beginning of a partnership that would dominate Eastern politics for a decade and eventually help destroy the Roman Republic's last fragile balance. Alexandria once again became more than a capital. It became the setting where Roman power was drawn into the orbit of the Ptolemaic court, where political alliance and personal intimacy fused into something neither Rome nor Egypt could thereafter treat lightly. In Alexandria, the bond between them seems to have strengthened in both its dimensions. Cleopatra offered Antony not only her person and her court, but the resources of Egypt, the prestige of one of the oldest monarchies in the Mediterranean, and a sovereign partner capable of helping him construct a durable Eastern base. Antony offered Cleopatra what Caesar's death had taken away, the support of the strongest Roman then active in the East. Yet the alliance was not simply a repetition of the Caesarian pattern. Cleopatra was older now, more experienced, and harder in judgment. She had survived exile, restoration, Roman upheaval, and the death of Caesar. She entered the Antony alliance not as a queen newly rescued from danger, but as a ruler who knew exactly how much could be won from a Roman partnership and exactly how much could be lost if it failed. There was opulence in this period, but there was also calculation under the opulence. Cleopatra had learned that Roman men were not abstractions. Each had his own ambitions, weaknesses, appetites, and style of command. Caesar had been approached through urgency and precision. Antony could be approached through splendor and affinity, but never by splendor alone. He needed Eastern support for military and political reasons, and Cleopatra ensured that Egypt would matter materially, not just symbolically. The alliance gave Antony access to money and provisions, while giving Cleopatra the chance to secure or recover territories and strengthen Egypt's position in the eastern Mediterranean. Their relationship was therefore personal in the richest sense, but also structural. It connected bodies, courts, treasuries, armies, and futures. For Cleopatra, this was the beginning of her greatest period of outward influence. During the years after Tarsus, her court became not simply the seat of an Egyptian monarchy, but a center of wider Eastern politics. Antony's need to govern and campaign across the eastern provinces meant that the Queen of Egypt could become indispensable in ways that reached beyond her own kingdom's borders. This did not yet amount to the full territorial expansion that would come later, but the direction was set. Cleopatra was no longer merely defending the remnants of her dynasty. She was helping shape an Eastern order in which Egypt might stand at the center rather than the margins. In this sense, the alliance with Antony marked a shift from preservation to ambition. The winter in Alexandria also had a symbolic importance that later Roman propaganda would exploit mercilessly. Antony in Egypt could be portrayed in Rome as a Roman leader corrupted by Eastern luxury, softened by pleasure, and drawn away from traditional Roman discipline. At the time, however, such portrayals had not yet hardened into the full propaganda war of the later 30s BC. In the early phase, what mattered most was that Antony and Cleopatra found in one another a mutually useful partnership. The later accusation that he had been bewitched into political self-destruction tells us as much about Roman anxieties as it does about the relationship itself. In these first years, Antony was not passively ensnared, and Cleopatra was not merely performing seduction. Both were choosing an alliance that served immediate interests and larger aspirations. The political geography of the Roman world briefly interrupted the closeness between them. Antony soon had to return west, where tensions with Octavian and other demands of triumviral politics required his presence. Britannica's student summary notes that after spending the winter of 41 to 40 BC with Cleopatra, Antony returned to Rome. This return brought complications. In the process of negotiating stability with Octavian, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, in 40 BC. Such a marriage might seem, at first glance, to place Cleopatra back into uncertainty, but the logic of Roman high politics was not the logic of personal exclusivity. Antony's marriage to Octavia was a political arrangement designed to preserve his standing within the triumviral order. It did not end his bond with Cleopatra. Instead, it revealed the multiple layers on which he operated: Roman husband, triumvir, Eastern commander, and increasingly, Cleopatra's partner. Around the same time, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Their births tied Antony to her dynasty not only through alliance but through children, extending the partnership into a more dynastic form. The names themselves carried symbolic resonance, with sun and moon suggesting cosmic pairing and royal imagination on a grand scale. The children mattered because they transformed the connection between Antony and Cleopatra into something future-oriented. This was no fleeting attachment, surviving only on memory and appetite. It had begun to create heirs, claims, and a framework through which a broader Eastern settlement could later be imagined. The old Ptolemaic pattern of dynastic display was now being renewed through Roman connection. By the later 30s BC, Antony had become convinced that stable coexistence with Octavian would not last, and his return to the East brought him again toward Cleopatra. World History Encyclopedia's Mark Antony timeline notes that in 37 BC, Cleopatra and her son Caesarion met Antony in Antioch. That reunion falls at the edge of the next section, where territorial grants and imperial pageantry become central. But even before that full expansion, the shape of the alliance was clear. Cleopatra had secured a place in Antony's Eastern system, not as an ornament, but as a partner whose resources, legitimacy, and political imagination amplified his own. Their relationship endured separation, Roman compromise, and the demands of multiple theaters because it served purposes too large to dissolve easily. It is important to see how far Cleopatra had come by this point. After Caesar's assassination, she had faced the sudden collapse of the framework protecting her rule. She had returned to Egypt, consolidated power, elevated Caesarion, and waded through Roman uncertainty. Now with Antony, she was no longer merely surviving a vacuum. She was actively shaping the next order. The difference is profound. Survival had taught her caution, but it had not dulled her ambition. When the right Roman partner appeared, she moved decisively. Using all the tools Alexandria and experience had given her, speech, symbolism, wealth, intelligence, and a sovereign sense of timing, the tone of this period is therefore different from the harder, narrower years immediately after Caesar's death. There is more splendor now, more theatrical confidence, and more expansive possibility. Cleopatra and Antony together seem to embody a different center of gravity for the Mediterranean, one not rooted in the old austerities of Rome alone, but in the wealth and ceremony of the East. Antony, often associated with Dionysian imagery, and Cleopatra, able to draw on both Egyptian and Greek divine symbolism, could present themselves in ways that were politically potent as well as visually unforgettable. At Tarsus and beyond, they were building not only an alliance but an image of power, grand enough to rival the claims of any Roman faction. And yet the seeds of future danger were already present. Any Roman leader who bound himself too closely to an Eastern queen exposed himself to attack from rivals who could frame the relationship as betrayal of Roman values. Any Egyptian queen who rested too much on one Roman man risked repeating, in altered form, the vulnerability she had known after Caesar's death. Cleopatra was too intelligent not to sense this, but ambition often requires acting within danger rather than waiting for danger to vanish. She and Antony chose to build something larger despite the risks. Perhaps because both understood that the Mediterranean was entering a final struggle in which small, cautious arrangements would not endure. So the rise of Antony and Cleopatra began with a summons that might have reduced her and became instead the start of her most expansive political partnership. At Tarsus, she transformed scrutiny into fascination. In Alexandria, she turned fascination into alliance, through wealth, performance, intelligence, and shared need. She and Antony fashioned a bond that was at once intimate and strategic, sumptuous and hard-edged. Egypt under Cleopatra ceased to be merely a kingdom surviving under Roman pressure. It became the core of an Eastern partnership with the power to challenge how the Roman world itself would be ordered. The next stage would bring the high point of that ambition: territories, children, spectacle, and the mounting tension with Octavian that would one day destroy them both. By the later years of the alliance with Antony, Cleopatra had moved beyond mere preservation. The long effort to hold her throne against rivals, exile, Roman intrusion, and dynastic collapse had given way to something more expansive. Between 37 and 32 BC, she stood at the height of her power, not simply as Queen of Egypt, but as the center of an Eastern political vision large enough to trouble Rome itself. Antony had returned to her, increasingly committed to an Eastern strategy that depended on Egyptian wealth and royal legitimacy. Cleopatra, in turn, was no longer content merely to survive under Roman shadow. She and Antony began to build a structure of power that looked, to admirers and enemies alike, almost imperial in reach. Their reunion in 37 BC marked an important step in that enlargement. By then, Antony had effectively given up on any durable settlement with Octavian, and he needed resources for his eastern campaigns, especially against Parthia. Britannica's chronology notes that he returned to Cleopatra seeking her financial support for that effort. This gave Cleopatra leverage of a kind no Ptolemaic ruler before her had possessed in quite the same form. Egypt's treasury, grain, and strategic location made her indispensable to Antony's ambitions, and indispensability is one of the rarest forms of security in politics. She was no longer only the queen who had charmed a Roman triumvir. She was the sovereign whose backing materially shaped the ambitions of the Roman East. From this point onward, the relationship acquired a wider dynastic cast. Cleopatra and Antony already had twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and in the years that followed they added another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. The children were more than a family. They were symbols around which a territorial and political future could be imagined. In the Hellenistic world, children of a ruling house were often placed within public narratives of destiny, and Cleopatra understood that instinct well. Antony, who increasingly moved within the language of Eastern kingship as much as Roman command, seems to have accepted that broader dynastic imagination. Their household became a political map in living form, with each child capable of carrying title, claim, and region. The turning point in this grander design came after Antony's campaigns in the east, especially following his Armenian successes and his humiliating failure against Parthia. Rather than allow defeat to define him, Antony returned to Alexandria and recast the story through ceremony. In 34 BC, he and Cleopatra staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. Britannica describes the donations as a celebration after the failed Parthian campaign, one that signaled their intention to rule the civilized world and alarmed Octavian deeply. World History Encyclopedia likewise describes a public spectacle in Alexandria where Antony and Cleopatra appeared on golden thrones with their children and proclaimed a redistribution of territories. This was pageantry, but it was not empty pageantry. It was an attempt to make political reality by ceremonial declaration. At the donations, Cleopatra was elevated in public splendor, and Caesarion was exalted beside her. According to the well-attested later traditions summarized in reference works, Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, while Caesarion was styled King of Kings and publicly associated with the divine and dynastic legacy of Julius Caesar. Their children with Antony were assigned realms or promised realms across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Some of these territories were still contested, and some were more aspirational than securely held. But the act itself mattered regardless. It announced that Antony and Cleopatra were imagining a reordered East in which Roman command, Hellenistic monarchy, dynastic succession, and divine symbolism would all be fused under their house. For Cleopatra, this was the fullest outward realization of the instincts she had carried since youth. She had always understood power as something theatrical as well as material, something that needed ritual language, visible symbolism, and multiple audiences. Now she stood in Alexandria, not merely as a restored Egyptian queen, but as the center of a political cosmos. The old Ptolemaic patterns of divine kingship, Greek court ceremonial, and Egyptian sacred monarchy were being extended outward into a larger imperial dream. In this vision, Egypt was not the anxious client kingdom her father had struggled to preserve through Roman bribery. It was the royal heart of an Eastern order, grand enough to rival Rome's own self-image. This was also the moment when Cleopatra's image became inseparable from ambition, on a scale that Rome found hard to tolerate. A foreign queen who remained useful could be accepted. A foreign queen who appeared to stand beside a Roman triumvir as partner in distributing kingdoms and naming heirs was another matter. Caesarion's elevation was especially dangerous. Britannica notes that Octavian's concern sharpened when Antony and Cleopatra signaled their wider intentions, and other summaries stress that declaring Caesarion the true son and rightful heir of Caesar directly threatened Octavian's political foundation as Caesar's adopted son. Cleopatra was not only asserting dynastic continuity, she was helping create a rival legitimacy that touched the most sensitive nerve in Roman politics. One can feel the confidence of these years in the sheer scale of the gesture. Antony and Cleopatra did not behave like rulers bracing for immediate collapse. They behaved like founders. Their children were not hidden in the background but displayed as inheritors of a future still being assigned shape. Alexandria was not treated as a secondary royal city beneath Rome's gaze, but as a stage from which the Eastern Mediterranean could be ceremonially ordered. Even Antony's failures were reframed through triumphal celebration. This was the high point of Cleopatra's political imagination made public. She had reached the place where survival, power, wealth, fertility, and symbolism could all be united into one commanding image. Yet confidence at such a scale has a way of producing its own enemies. Octavian saw immediately what could be made of it. He was, as Britannica's Antony biography puts it, more efficient, more energetic, and more politically exacting than his rival. He understood that wars are often prepared in language before they are settled in battle. The donations allowed him to present Antony not as a Roman leader exercising strategy in the East, but as a man who had surrendered Roman dignity to a foreign queen. Cleopatra became the ideal target for this campaign. She could be cast as Eastern, luxurious, dangerous, manipulative, and alien to Roman virtue, while Antony could be depicted as weakened, seduced, and estranged from his own people. This propaganda war intensified as the 30s drew toward their close. Britannica notes that Octavian seized Antony's will, or what he claimed to be Antony's will, and publicized the shocking suggestion that Antony intended to be buried beside Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether every detail was used fairly mattered less than the effect. Octavian turned private connection into public treason. He argued that Antony had bestowed Roman possessions on a foreign woman and meant to shift the center of power away from Rome toward Alexandria. In such a telling, Cleopatra was no longer simply Queen of Egypt. She was the embodiment of a rival civilization, pulling one of Rome's own leaders into betrayal. The story was politically devastating because it transformed strategic alliance into moral contamination. It is one of the enduring injustices of Cleopatra's memory that Roman propaganda proved so durable. Later generations often inherited Octavian's framing without fully noticing it. But in the years themselves, Cleopatra was not merely a seductress at the edge of Roman decline. She was a sovereign exercising intelligence, wealth, legitimacy, and dynastic planning at the highest level available to her. The fact that Octavian needed such an intense propaganda campaign is evidence of how formidable the Antony-Cleopatra partnership had become. Lesser threats do not require such elaborate moral theater. Still, the danger was real, because propaganda in Rome was not separate from power. It shaped the Senate, public opinion, military loyalty, and the moral frame in which war could be justified. By 32 BC, the breach between Antony and Octavian had become irreparable. The Second Triumvirate was ending, and the Mediterranean was moving toward final civil war. Cleopatra at this point remained central to Antony's political world, but that centrality cut both ways. It gave her influence of immense scale, yet also made her the perfect foil in Octavian's campaign. Rome could be told that the coming struggle was not merely against Antony, who still had Roman standing, but against Cleopatra, whose foreignness made the conflict easier to package as a defense of Roman order. Britannica's larger Roman timeline places the end of triumviral rule in this same narrowing period, just before the conflict that would culminate at Actium in 31 BC. That is what gives this period its special tone, grandeur touched by strain. On the surface, these were Cleopatra's greatest years. She had territories, children, ceremony, a powerful Roman partner, and a court capable of rivaling any in the world. Her authority extended beyond Egypt, and her public image shone with confidence. But underneath, the structure was becoming more precarious. The larger the Eastern vision grew, the more intolerable it became to Octavian. The more openly Caesarion was elevated, the more dangerous he became. The more Antony lived as Cleopatra's ally and companion, the more easily Rome could be taught to see him as lost. Greatness was ripening, but so was vulnerability. There is also a human poignancy in the fact that Cleopatra's fullest public success came so near the edge of catastrophe. She had spent years learning how to survive within unstable structures. Now, at last, she seemed to have helped create one large enough to hold her ambitions. Alexandria blazed again as a royal capital of consequence, not merely memory. Her children gave visible form to continuity. Antony gave military and political scale to her aspirations. For a moment, it must have seemed possible that the Roman world might be matched, negotiated with, or even partially reimagined through this Eastern partnership. That possibility was real enough to alarm Octavian into total opposition. So the years from 37 to 32 BC were the summit of Cleopatra's power and image. They revealed her not just as a survivor of dynastic ruin or the ally of great Roman men, but as a monarch with imperial imagination. The donations of Alexandria, the territorial expansion, the public elevation of her children, and the sharpening hostility of Octavian all belonged to the same moment. It was the moment when Cleopatra appeared most confident, most radiant, and most dangerous to her enemies. It was also the moment when that radiance began to attract the full force of Roman destruction. The next stage would strip away ceremony and test whether the world she and Antony had built could withstand war itself. By 32 BC, the long rivalry between Antony and Octavian had hardened into the final struggle from which only one could emerge with mastery of the Roman world. The years of propaganda, accusation, and ceremonial defiance had done their work. Antony and Cleopatra had built an Eastern partnership of immense splendor and alarming political scale. while Octavian had steadily taught Rome to see that partnership not as an alternative center of order, but as a threat to Roman identity itself. When the break finally came, it was framed with calculated precision. Octavian declared war not formally on Antony, who remained too Roman and too entangled with the state to serve as the perfect public enemy, but on Cleopatra. That choice mattered. It allowed the coming civil war to be presented as a defense of Rome against a foreign queen, even though Antony stood at the heart of the conflict. There was terrible skill in that framing. Cleopatra had spent years making herself central to Antony's eastern power, and now that very centrality was turned against her. She could be named as the source of corruption, luxury, eastern excess, and dynastic ambition, while Antony could be presented as a Roman leader seduced away from his proper loyalties. Octavian's campaign succeeded because it simplified a complex political reality into a moral drama the Roman world could understand. The conflict was not really about private desire, still less about some timeless opposition between Rome and feminine cunning. It was about sovereignty, succession, and control of the Mediterranean, but by making Cleopatra the declared enemy, Octavian found a way to make that struggle feel both legal and righteous to his supporters. Antony and Cleopatra did not respond as rulers already resigned to ruin. They still possessed formidable resources. Antony commanded fleets and armies. Cleopatra brought Egypt's wealth, ships, and the remaining force of her monarchy. Yet beneath the outward strength, strain was growing. The alliance that had once seemed dazzlingly expansive was now burdened by the need to defend itself against a disciplined and increasingly effective adversary. Octavian, aided above all by the abilities of Agrippa, pressed the war with patience and method. Antony and Cleopatra, by contrast, were trying to preserve a fragile coalition under conditions where morale, supply, and confidence mattered as much as spectacle. Great political partnerships can survive years of ambition more easily than they survive the narrowing pressure of military failure. The decisive encounter came at Actium on September 2, 31 BC, off the western coast of Greece. Britannica describes it as the naval battle in which Octavian defeated Antony and became master of the Roman world. The battle has often been remembered through large and dramatic images, but its true significance lies in what it settled. This was not only a military engagement, it was the moment when the Eastern alternative represented by Antony and Cleopatra failed to hold against Octavian's colder, steadier consolidation of power. After years in which the future of Rome and the East seemed open, Actium began to close that future down. The battle itself remains surrounded by argument over tactics and intention, but the broad shape is clear enough. Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian's fleet under conditions already unfavorable to them, with disease, desertion, and declining confidence weakening Antony's position. During the engagement, Cleopatra's squadron broke through and fled, and Antony followed her. Later hostile traditions treated this as proof of cowardice, feminine manipulation, or fatal weakness. Those judgments are too neat for events of such complexity. It may have been a planned breakout once the battle turned hopeless, or an attempt to preserve some remnant of force for the defense of Egypt. Whatever the exact intent, the effect was disastrous. The fleet and army they left behind could not recover the moral and strategic coherence that had already been framed. From that moment, decline accelerated. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt, but they returned not as rulers regrouping from a reversible setback. They returned as leaders whose aura of inevitability had been broken. Actium did not kill them immediately, but it deprived them of the one thing on which all great political structures finally depend: belief. Allies began to fall away. Support weakened. The image of an Eastern order capable of rivaling Rome's future could no longer be sustained with the same force once its champions had been defeated in the field and forced back to Alexandria. Octavian had not yet taken Egypt, but he had already won the deeper battle of momentum. For Cleopatra, the retreat to Egypt must have carried a bitter familiarity. Earlier in life, she had known exile, uncertainty, and the need to rebuild from the margins. But this was different. Then, she had still been rising, and the world had still contained openings through which boldness could work. Now she was returning from the summit of her power toward a narrowing end. The court in Alexandria could still stage ceremony, could still command loyalty, could still imagine defenses and negotiations. But the larger Mediterranean balance had shifted decisively. Octavian was advancing not merely as a rival commander, but as the man history had begun to gather around. Cleopatra had survived many crises by reading power accurately. She could not have failed to see by now how grave the situation had become. Antony's own position deteriorated sharply after Actium. Britannica notes that when Octavian's fleet gained the upper hand, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and Antony joined her there. When Octavian arrived in Alexandria in the summer of 30, Antony and then Cleopatra committed suicide. Between those 2 points lay a period of shrinking options. Antony still had moments of resistance left in him, and there were attempts to organize defense, preserve dignity, and perhaps negotiate. But the underlying reality had changed. The man who had once divided the Roman world with Octavian was now cut off from lasting victory. Each effort after Actium had the feel of a gesture made against a future already settling into another man's hands. Cleopatra, meanwhile, did not simply collapse into despair. Even in defeat, she appears to have explored alternatives. Later sources preserved the impression of negotiation, calculation, and attempts to protect at least some portion of her children's future or her own royal dignity. That instinct fits everything known of her character. She had never been a figure who mistook emotion for strategy. Even when the military position worsened, she remained capable of planning, weighing, and acting. But no amount of intelligence could recreate the world that had existed before Actium. Her power had always depended on combining Egypt's resources with a Roman partner strong enough to keep other Romans at bay. After Actium, that formula no longer worked. Antony had ceased to be a shield and had become, instead, part of the wreckage she had to reckon with. This is what makes the war with Rome feel so tragic. It was not a sudden collapse caused by one bad day alone. It was the final unveiling of tensions long present in Cleopatra's rise. Her alliance with Antony had brought her to the height of grandeur, but it had also made her the ideal enemy for Octavian. Her use of spectacle, dynastic symbolism, and Eastern kingship had expanded her authority. Yet those same things could be translated into accusations of foreign arrogance and anti-Roman ambition. The children who once embodied a radiant future now belonged to a house under mortal threat. Actium did not invent these contradictions. It exposed them beyond repair. In Rome, the consequences were equally profound. The victory over Antony and Cleopatra opened the way for Octavian's final consolidation. Britannica states plainly that Actium made Octavian master of the Roman world. The old republic, already weakened by decades of internal violence, moved rapidly toward a new form of rule centered on one man. Cleopatra's war against Octavian was therefore not merely the last chapter of a queen's life. It was part of the last great struggle over what Rome itself would become. Her defeat helped clear the path toward imperial rule under the man who would soon be known as Augustus. Back in Egypt, however, such large constitutional meanings would have mattered less than the immediate sensation of contraction. The kingdom that had once seemed able to influence the succession of the Roman world was now reduced to defending its own survival against invasion. Resources were thinner. Trust was thinner. The old confidence of the donations of Alexandria, of children publicly assigned kingdoms and futures, must have seemed painfully distant. Alexandria remained a city of memory, brilliance, and royal ceremony. But it was also becoming a trap. Cleopatra and Antony had retreated to the very center of their power only to find that power enclosed. There is a severe inevitability to this phase. Though inevitability should not be confused with passivity, Antony and Cleopatra still acted, still resisted, still tried to preserve some meaning in defeat. But by the time they reached Egypt after Actium, the direction of events had become painfully clear. They had lost not just a battle but the contest for initiative. Octavian could choose the timing of the end. He could let attrition, fear, and political isolation do work on his behalf before delivering the final blow. The Great Eastern Partnership, so alive with confidence only a few years earlier, was now reduced to holding out against a Roman future already taking shape without it. So the years from 32 to 30 BC bring Cleopatra's story into its tragic descent. War is declared in her name. Actium breaks the military spine of the Antony-Cleopatra alliance. Retreat to Egypt exposes how much of their power had depended on movement, prestige, and belief. Political and military support ebbs away, and Alexandria becomes the last stage on which a doomed sovereignty tries to preserve its form. By the end of this section, the final crisis is no longer approaching from a distance. It has arrived at the gates. What remains is not the question of whether Cleopatra's world will fall, but how she will meet its ending. When Octavian entered the last phase of his campaign against Antony and Cleopatra in the summer of 30 BC, the outcome of the war had already been decided in its broadest sense. Actium had broken the power of their alliance, shattered confidence in their cause, and left Egypt exposed to the advance of the man who would soon become Augustus. Yet history rarely ends at the exact moment of defeat. It lingers in final decisions, and attempts at negotiation, in the preservation or destruction of dignity, and in the question of how those who are losing choose to meet the end. For Cleopatra, the fall of Alexandria was not only the loss of a city or a kingdom, it was the end of the Ptolemaic world into which she had been born, the extinction of a line that had ruled Egypt since the age after Alexander, and the closing of every political path she had spent her life learning to navigate. Alexandria itself had always stood at the center of her story. It was the city of her birth, her education, her earliest political lessons, her restoration with Caesar, her partnership with Antony, and the high ceremonies of her greatest ambitions. Now it became the setting of final contraction. Octavian advanced toward it not merely as a victorious general, but as the representative of a new Roman order for which there was no place for an independent Cleopatra. Egypt was too rich and too strategically valuable to be left in uncertain hands, and Caesarion, as the child Cleopatra had long associated with Julius Caesar, posed too dangerous a symbolic problem for Octavian to ignore. The conquest of Alexandria therefore carried meaning beyond conquest alone. It was the practical annexation of Egypt and the elimination of a dynastic alternative. Mark Antony still tried to resist, the man who had once shared the Roman world with Octavian, and who had imagined with Cleopatra an Eastern order broad enough to rival any power in Rome, did not simply vanish into passivity while the enemy closed in. But by this stage, resistance had narrowed into gestures made under the pressure of inevitability. Britannica summarizes the end plainly. When Octavian arrived in Alexandria in the summer of 30, Antony and then Cleopatra committed suicide. Between those compressed words lies a final period of confusion, rumor, and failing command. Antony's forces could no longer hold with conviction, and the old assurance that charisma, loyalty, and daring might reverse the tide had ebbed away. What remained was not the full freedom of action enjoyed by great conquerors, but the painful, shrinking field left to the defeated. The ancient story of Antony's death has endured because it gathers so much pathos into so little space. According to the traditional account summarized in Britannica's student and general references, Antony was falsely told that Cleopatra was dead. Believing it, he stabbed himself. The wound did not kill him immediately. Word then reached him that Cleopatra was still alive, having taken refuge in the mausoleum or tomb she had prepared for herself. Antony insisted on being taken to her, and there, in her presence, he died. Whether every detail has reached us free from literary shaping is impossible to know, but the broad outline has been handed down consistently enough to define the memory of the event. Antony died by his own hand, under the shadow of defeat and in the final proximity of the woman with whom his fate had become inseparable. There's a terrible fittingness in that scene. Antony, whose life had so often been large, martial, and public, met death not in renewed battle, but in a confined and collapsing world, brought to the end by loss, misinformation, and the impossibility of recovery. For Cleopatra, his death must have meant several things at once. It was the death of a lover, certainly, and of the Roman partner through whom she had reached the summit of her power, but it was also the death of the last practical shield between herself and Octavian. Whatever negotiations, delays, or symbolic gestures remained possible after Antony died, the central fact had changed. Cleopatra was now alone before the Roman victor, with no army, no partner, and no surviving route back to the political scale on which she had once acted. Even then, Cleopatra did not simply surrender her will. The sources suggest that she still sought some form of negotiation or understanding with Octavian, though the limits of what he would allow were narrow. Britannica notes that after Antony's death, Cleopatra buried him and then took her own life, while some summaries mention a failed attempt to beguile or influence Octavian before her suicide. That detail, whether interpreted as charm, persuasion, or political appeal, fits the deeper consistency of her life. She had always used every available instrument: ceremony, intellect, timing, presence, and personal force. It would have been unlike her to abandon calculation altogether while any sliver of possibility remained. But by this point, Octavian needed not accommodation but conclusion. He had too much to gain by ending the line cleanly. What Octavian wanted from Cleopatra was not difficult to infer. A living queen could be useful as a captive, and later tradition often assumes he intended to display her in a Roman triumph. For Cleopatra, such a fate would have been more than humiliation. It would have been the final inversion of everything she had defended throughout her life. She had fought exile, rival siblings, Roman intervention, civil war, and propaganda in order to remain sovereign. To be carried to Rome as an ornament of another man's victory, stripped of agency and turned into a lesson in Roman supremacy, would have reduced her from actor to spectacle. A ruler who had understood so clearly the power of public image would have grasped this with unusual sharpness. Death, in that context, could appear not only as despair, but as the last remaining form of control. So Cleopatra prepared for her end with the same combination of symbolism and determination that had marked the rest of her life. The prevailing view, according to Britannica, is that after burying Antony, the 39-year-old Cleopatra took her own life. The traditional version says she died by means of an asp, a serpent associated in later memory with Egyptian royalty and divine symbolism. Yet Britannica also stresses that how she died is uncertain, and that some scholars have proposed alternatives, including surreptitious murder by Octavian. World History Encyclopedia reports the familiar tradition that she poisoned herself through a snake bite, often identified by modern scholars as an Egyptian cobra rather than a generic asp. What matters most historically is not the theatrical exactness of the method, which remains debated, but the widely accepted conclusion that her death was understood in antiquity as self-chosen, or at least represented that way. That uncertainty deserves to be handled calmly. The image of the asp is powerful and has survived because it condenses politics, symbolism, and mortality into one memorable emblem: a queen of Egypt, associated with divine rulership, ending her life by a creature that could itself be read as royal or sacred, is the kind of image history preserves even when details are unstable. But the ancient record is not perfectly unified, and modern scholars have long noted the practical difficulties of the snakebite story. The earliest surviving traditions do not close every question. Britannica explicitly says the manner is uncertain and that murder has also been suggested. This does not erase the traditional account, but it does require restraint. Cleopatra most likely died by suicide after Antony's death and Octavian's conquest. The exact means remain unresolved. Her death, whenever and however precisely it occurred in August of 30 BC, carried consequences beyond the personal. Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. With her gone, the centuries-long experiment of Macedonian Greek rule in Egypt came to an end. The house founded after Alexander's conquests, which had blended Hellenistic monarchy with Egyptian kingship and produced one of the ancient world's most brilliant royal capitals, no longer had a sovereign future. Egypt would not pass to another Ptolemy in any meaningful independent sense. It would pass into Roman control. The death of one woman therefore marked the end of an era that had lasted nearly 300 years. The fate of Caesarion completed that ending with particular severity. Britannica's Caesarion entry and question page state that after Egypt fell to Octavian in 30, Cleopatra sent Caesarion away toward safety, but Octavian lured him back to Alexandria, where the 17-year-old king was executed. World History Encyclopedia likewise says that Octavian had Caesarion killed. This act was politically ruthless, but entirely intelligible. As long as Caesarion lived, he represented not merely Cleopatra's son, but a possible rival claim linked to Julius Caesar. Octavian, who had built his own legitimacy as Caesar's adopted heir, could not tolerate such a symbol remaining alive, especially in Egypt. Caesarion's death was therefore not incidental cruelty. It was the final removal of an alternative dynastic future. There is something especially bleak in Caesarion's end, because he had been, for Cleopatra, the vessel of continuation. She had elevated him as co-ruler, styled him within the language of kingship, and placed immense symbolic weight upon his connection to Caesar. Through him, she had tried to imagine a future in which Egypt might survive the Roman storm, not only by endurance, but by dynastic adaptation. In the donations of Alexandria, he had been publicly exalted. In the final months, he became instead a danger too obvious for Octavian to spare. The child once presented as the fusion of Egyptian monarchy and Caesarian legitimacy was reduced, in the victor's eyes, to a problem that had to be solved by execution. With Caesarion's death, Cleopatra's political imagination for the future died as well. Her children by Antony were treated differently. World History Encyclopedia notes that they were brought to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister. That distinction reveals the logic of Octavian's settlement. Caesarion, because of his direct symbolic connection to Julius Caesar, could not be left alive. The younger children, while dynastically significant, posed less immediate danger and could be absorbed into the Roman world as living reminders of a defeated house rather than as active claimants. Their survival softens nothing essential about the destruction of Cleopatra's dynasty, but it does show that Octavian's severity was strategic, not indiscriminate. He was eliminating threats, not simply indulging vengeance. With Cleopatra dead and Caesarion executed, Egypt was annexed into Roman power. Britannica's Battle of Actium Intri states that after Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, they died by suicide and Egypt became a province of Rome. This transition was of enormous importance. Egypt was not treated like an ordinary senatorial territory. Its grain, wealth, and strategic position made it central to the new regime. Control of Egypt strengthened Octavian materially and politically, helping make possible the durable settlement through which he would soon become Augustus. In that sense, Cleopatra's death was woven directly into the birth of the Roman Empire. The end of her reign was one of the conditions of his beginning. The symbolic power of this ending is one reason Cleopatra's death has never faded from historical memory. Her life had already been unusually charged. A queen of Egypt, a ruler educated in Alexandria, partner of Caesar, partner of Antony, adversary of Octavian, and the last sovereign of her line, to die at the moment when Rome was passing from republican violence into imperial mastery, gave her end a historical resonance larger than biography alone. She became, almost at once, both a person and an emblem. For Roman writers, she could stand as the dangerous Eastern queen whose fall validated Rome's victory. For later ages, she could become a figure of doomed grandeur, of intelligence and theatrical self-command held against overwhelming force. The facts of her death mattered deeply, but so did the way they invited retelling. Yet the most responsible way to see her final days is not through legend alone. Cleopatra was not simply a romantic heroine ending her life in noble despair. She was a ruler making the last decision left available within a world that had closed around her. Antony's death removed her final major ally. Octavian's victory made independent rule impossible. The threat of public humiliation and dynastic extinction was immediate. Caesarion's danger was obvious. Her own options had narrowed from diplomacy and war to the choice of how not to be used by the conqueror. Seen this way, her death belongs less to myth than to the hard logic that had structured her entire career. She met the end as she had met life, by trying to retain agency where agency was almost gone. So the fall of Alexandria and the deaths that followed close more than the biography of one queen. They close the history of Ptolemaic Egypt and clear the way for Roman imperial rule. Antony dies by suicide under the pressure of defeat and false news. Cleopatra dies soon after, traditionally by asphyte, though the exact method remains uncertain. Caesarion, the last hope of dynastic continuation, is executed on Octavian's orders or at his direction. Egypt passes into Roman hands, and the old house of the Ptolemies disappears. The ending is somber, not only because it is final, but because it reveals how completely the Mediterranean world had changed. The kingdoms that once stood beside Rome were now being folded into it. Cleopatra's death is remembered because in her and in her ending, an age itself seems to come to rest. Cleopatra's life ended in 30 BC, but her true contest with history began only after her death. Very few rulers have been remembered for so long while being so persistently transformed by the needs of others. During her own lifetime, she was a working monarch, the last active sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a queen who governed Egypt for more than 2 decades, influenced Roman politics at a decisive moment, and built her power through intelligence, timing, display, and unusual adaptability. Yet the Cleopatra who survived in memory was never simply that ruler. Almost immediately, she began to be recast into symbols, warnings, fantasies, and arguments. Her afterlife became nearly as consequential as her life, because later ages often learn more from the Cleopatra they invented than from the Cleopatra who actually reigned. The first great act of invention came from Rome, and it came from victory. Octavian had defeated Antony and Cleopatra in what was, at its core, the final stage of a Roman civil war. But civil wars are awkward things for victors to explain. It was politically cleaner to say that Rome had been saved from a foreign danger than to admit that Romans had once again destroyed one another for mastery. Cleopatra offered the perfect answer to that problem. Britannica notes that she was stripped of political validity in Roman memory and turned into an immoral foreign woman who had tempted upright Roman men, a version of events that made her a useful enemy for Octavian, because he preferred to be remembered as fighting outsiders rather than fellow citizens. This was not incidental slander. It was foundational propaganda, and its durability shaped almost everything that followed. That Roman recasting had several advantages at once. It preserved Antony from being the sole face of treason by sharing blame with Cleopatra. It made Octavian's victory seem morally restorative rather than personally ambitious. It turned the East into a theater of corruption against which Roman discipline could define itself, and it reduced a formidable queen into a story type that later generations would recognize immediately. The dangerous woman whose allure disordered men and states. The more Cleopatra's political intelligence could be translated into seduction, the less seriously her actual statecraft had to be taken. In that sense, the earliest version of her legacy was not merely hostile. It was strategically reductive. It sought to explain her influence in ways that deprived her of legitimate power. Even the ancient sources that preserve her memory more richly are shaped by this inheritance. Plutarch, writing about a century after Cleopatra's death, became one of the most influential transmitters of her story to later ages. Britannica's discussion of Cleopatra through the ages emphasizes that his account passed into European literature with enormous force, especially through Sir Thomas North's English translation, which later fed directly into Shakespeare. Plutarch is invaluable, but he is also distant. He wrote in a Roman imperial world that had already absorbed Cleopatra into its own moral and political storytelling. He was not simply preserving facts. He was arranging character, motive, and judgment within a literary tradition that liked to treat lives as moral exempla. That means Cleopatra comes down to us partly through a lens already polished by interpretation. And yet Plutarch also helped preserve something that Roman propaganda alone might have buried, in the well-known description echoed by Britannica's modern discussion of Cleopatra's appearance. He did not insist that her beauty was overwhelming in itself. Instead, he stressed the force of her presence, her charm, her voice, and the vivid intelligence of her company. That distinction matters. It suggests that what made Cleopatra memorable was not reducible to physical attractiveness. However later art and film might prefer to imagine her, she was compelling because she could speak, persuade, adapt, and command attention in ways that exceeded the usual categories through which ancient male writers tried to explain female influence. Even within a tradition often unfriendly to powerful women, something of her active mind still shows through. This tension lies at the center of Cleopatra's enduring reputation. She is one of those rare historical figures who exist in two forms at once: and neither has ever fully displaced the other. One Cleopatra is the ruler recovered by history, a queen of Greek Macedonian descent who ruled Egypt, identified herself with Egyptian kingship, and used language, religion, diplomacy, and spectacle with unusual skill. The other Cleopatra is the legend, the seductress, the enchantress, the woman of the barge, the lover of Caesar and Antony, the queen with the asp. Britannica notes that she came to represent, as no other woman of antiquity did, the prototype of the romantic femme fatale. That image has been fantastically durable, not because it is historically sufficient, but because it is dramatically irresistible. What is striking is how often later cultures have preferred the legendary version even when evidence points toward the political one. The reason is not difficult to see. Beauty and romance are easier to popularize than grain policy, dynastic legitimacy, multilingual diplomacy, or the structure of late Hellenistic monarchy. A woman who shaped politics by intelligence can be unsettling in ways a woman who shaped politics by desire seems easier to contain. The old stereotype allows power to be reinterpreted as enchantment. It explains away achievement by placing it in the body rather than the mind. Britannica's modern discussion makes exactly this corrective point, observing that the sultry image likely descends from Octavian's narrative and obscures Cleopatra's competence as a ruler. The reassessment of her legacy in modern scholarship has therefore involved more than adding details. It has required undoing an ancient habit of explanation. To recover Cleopatra historically is also to recover Egypt. For a long time, especially in Western literary tradition, she was treated chiefly as a figure in Roman history, almost as though her importance depended on Caesar and Antony rather than on her own throne. But World History Encyclopedia stresses a necessary correction. Although Cleopatra belonged by ancestry to the Macedonian Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, she ruled as an Egyptian queen and consciously presented herself within Egyptian as well as Greek traditions. This matters because it changes the center of gravity. She was not merely a glamorous interruption in the lives of Roman men. She was the last sovereign of a kingdom trying to preserve itself against Rome's expansion, using every available political and symbolic resource. Once that frame is restored, her relationships with Caesar and Antony become part of her reign, not substitutes for it. That more grounded view has grown stronger in modern historical reassessment. Cleopatra is increasingly understood not as an exotic exception, but as a highly capable monarch operating under extraordinary pressure. She ruled for about 22 years, survived exile, civil conflict, Roman intervention, and dynastic instability, and repeatedly adapted to changing political realities with remarkable speed. World History Encyclopedia emphasizes that she represented the last significant threat to Roman authority, and that her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Those are not the terms in which one speaks of a decorative figure. They are the terms reserved for a serious political actor whose defeat altered the balance of the Mediterranean. The shift in emphasis from temptress to strategist has been one of the most important changes in Cleopatra's modern legacy. Even so, myth never retreats completely. Cleopatra remains too symbolically rich for that. She stands at the meeting point of several themes that later cultures find endlessly compelling: East and West, monarchy and republic, femininity and sovereignty, eros and power, performance and politics, rise and ruin. She is also placed at a historical hinge. Her death and the annexation of Egypt came at the very moment when Octavian was moving from Civil War victor to master of the Roman world. Britannica's Battle of Actium entry notes that Octavian's victory made him master of the Roman world, and Cleopatra's fall belongs directly to that transition. Because she stands at the end of one order and the beginning of another, she has never been merely an individual memory. She has become a way of imagining the close of an age. It is partly for this reason that literature found her irresistible. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra remains perhaps the single most influential later transformation of her image. Britannica explains that Shakespeare drew on Plutarch via North's translation, but gave Cleopatra a deeper and more heroic life than the more morally disapproving tradition allowed. In Shakespeare, she is dazzling, unstable, witty, proud, manipulative, passionate, theatrical, and profoundly alive. She's not cleansed of contradiction. Rather, contradiction becomes the very source of her greatness. This was a major turning point in her legacy. Cleopatra ceased to be merely a Roman caution and became one of world literature's largest tragic figures. That change opened the way for later poets, painters, composers, and dramatists to treat her not only as morally suspect, but as inexhaustibly human. Once literature enlarged her, visual culture amplified her still further. Paintings of Cleopatra multiplied across the early modern and modern periods, often dwelling on the most theatrical scenes. The meeting with Caesar, the barge at Tarsus, the testing of poisons, the death by asp. Later film inherited and intensified this preference for spectacle. Britannica's entry on the 1963 film Cleopatra reflects how firmly popular culture came to center her romances, pageantry, and downfall. Cinema made her glittering. It gave her marble palaces, elaborate processions, impossible costumes, and a face designed to fix itself in public imagination. The result was not historical precision, but it was not trivial either. Film confirmed Cleopatra as one of the very few ancient figures who remain instantly recognizable across the modern world. What those portrayals often preserve, even when they distort details, is the inseparability of image and power in Cleopatra's life. She understood that rulership was performed. She ruled in a world where divine symbolism, court ceremony, ethnic identity, dynastic legitimacy, and public display all mattered. So it is not accidental that later ages remember her visually. They are responding, however imperfectly, to something real about how she exercised authority. The problem is not that artists have noticed her theatricality. The problem is that theatricality has too often been detached from its political purpose, as though display were vanity rather than a language of rule. The most balanced modern understanding sees that Cleopatra's image was neither a disguise for power nor an alternative to power. It was one of the forms power took in her hands. Her legacy as a symbol of female power has also remained unstable, and this instability has helped keep her relevant. Some generations have treated her as the archetype of destructive femininity, the woman whose influence over men overturns proper order. Others have admired her as a figure of unusual self-possession, education, and command. A woman who moved in a male-dominated political world, not as a passive participant, but as a sovereign force. Neither reading is entirely wrong, and neither is sufficient. Cleopatra did use personal relationships politically, because in her world such relationships were political. She also governed, negotiated, learned languages, crafted dynastic claims, and fought to preserve her kingdom. That complexity is precisely why she remains usable to so many different arguments about women and authority. She can be feared, admired, romanticized, criticized, and reclaimed, often all at once. Questions about her beauty show this process in miniature. Modern audiences often approach Cleopatra expecting a verdict on her physical appearance, as though her historical significance can be unlocked by deciding whether she was beautiful. But Britannica's modern discussion, drawing back through Plutarch, suggests that such curiosity already reflects a distortion. Cleopatra mattered because she was memorable in person, intellectually agile, linguistically skilled, and theatrically intelligent. Her face alone cannot explain her. The persistence of that question, however, tells us something important about legacy. Posterity often prefers visible, intimate, and bodily explanations for power, especially when the powerful figure is a woman. To shift the conversation from beauty to presence is therefore not a small adjustment. It is part of a larger effort to take her seriously on her own terms. At the same time, the more serious Cleopatra becomes historically, the more impressive her actual achievement appears. She inherited a weakened kingdom under Roman pressure. She survived a palace struggle with her brother, regained her throne through alliance and calculation, maintained power through the death of Caesar and the rise of the triumvirs, and then helped shape one of the last great alternatives to Octavian's ascendancy. World History Encyclopedia and Britannica alike underscored that her fall marked the end of the Ptolemaic kingdom and helped clear the path for Rome's new imperial order. In plain terms, She was one of the last rulers in the Mediterranean who could still force Rome to reckon with an independent Eastern monarchy. That is a far more substantial legacy than the old caricatures allowed. Perhaps that is why Cleopatra never settles into one final image. The closer one comes to the historical queen, the more one sees how difficult she is to confine. She was Greek by dynasty, Egyptian by throne, Hellenistic by education, and Mediterranean by circumstance. She could appear as pharaoh, as queen, as divine consort, as diplomat, as mother, as rival, as ally, as enemy. She belonged to a kingdom already ancient when Rome was still young, yet she also lived at the exact moment when Roman power became something new. She is therefore remembered not only because she was extraordinary, but because she gathered several histories into one life. The history of Hellenistic monarchy, the history of Roman civil war, the history of empires making, and the history of how women in power are written about afterward. So Cleopatra's legacy is not simply that she fascinates. Many historical figures fascinate. Her legacy is that she continues to generate competing truths. Roman memory made her into an enemy. Literary tradition made her into a heroine. Popular culture made her into spectacle. Modern scholarship has worked to recover her as a ruler, whose intelligence and political seriousness were long obscured by the fantasies of her enemies and admirers alike. None of these Cleopatras has entirely displaced the others. They coexist, overlap, and struggle. That is why she endures. She remains one of the rare ancient figures whose name still carries argument inside it. To speak of Cleopatra is still to ask what power looks like, who gets to define it, and how history transforms a living ruler into a symbol that never quite stops changing.